There is a very specific type of silence that falls over a professional kitchen when the person who actually understands the food is pushed out of the way. You learn exactly what your years of loyalty are worth the day a new culinary director walks into your workspace, looks at the fermentation lab you built from scratch, and asks when the storage closet is going to be cleared out. That was my introduction to the man hired to turn our critically acclaimed dining experience into a franchise lifestyle brand. He strutted through the stainless steel corridors in a pristine chef's coat that had clearly never seen a drop of hot oil, flanked by a trailing entourage of public relations assistants and freshly graduated culinary students.
I was standing next to the climate-controlled aging chambers, holding the daily acidity logs for our proprietary misos and cured proteins, waiting to give him the operational rundown. He gave me a brief, dismissive nod, told me to make sure the delivery docks were swept before evening service, and walked right past me. It was as if my decade of meticulous, unseen labor simply did not register in his reality.
Years ago, this restaurant was nothing more than a cramped, unventilated kitchen in an alleyway, run by three exhausted people with a wild concept and virtually zero funding. I was originally brought in to prep vegetables and wash dishes, but anyone who has ever survived the brutal opening months of an independent restaurant knows that your job description is completely irrelevant. I was the one who became obsessed with preservation, microbiology, and flavor extraction. I spent my nights reading obscure textbooks, slowly cultivating the wild yeasts, the complex broths, and the signature aged vinegars that eventually gave our menu its entire identity.
I never fought to be the public face of the restaurant. I never wanted my name in the glowing magazine reviews or on the awards we started winning. I was perfectly content working in the quiet hours before dawn, needing only a scale and notebook and the smell of toasted spices to feel fulfilled. I was the bridge between the raw ingredients and the final masterpiece, building the deep foundational flavors while the executive chefs focused on the beautiful plating and the social media presence.
We survived those early chaotic years because I made sure every single component that left our prep kitchen was chemically and fundamentally perfect.
Then the inevitable happened. Our success attracted an aggressive hospitality investment group, and the atmosphere shifted overnight. A massive infusion of capital meant sudden expansion, and everyone began acting like every dinner service was a red carpet event. That was right around the time the new culinary director was installed.
He babbled endlessly about streamlining our prep cycles, optimizing ingredient costs, and eliminating what he called culinary clutter. I watched as my access was systematically restricted. The specialized equipment I had ordered was relocated to make room for generic, high-volume production machines. All while the original founders, the people I had bled with in that alleyway kitchen, looked the other way, mesmerized by the promise of franchise wealth.
They did not fire me outright because doing so would have required a complicated severing of my original informal contracts, and they simply did not want to deal with the friction. Instead, they shoved me into a damp, forgotten storage room in the deepest sub-basement, reducing my role to basic inventory receiving and stripping away all my developmental responsibilities. The very chefs who used to call me in a panic on a Saturday night because a sauce had broken suddenly stopped making eye contact in the hallways. It was as if my absolute dedication to the craft became a liability the moment I stopped fitting their new corporate vision of a modern gastronomy brand.
Rather than making a scene, I chose to sit back in the basement and observe as they slowly realized how much they relied on the living foundations I had built. They assigned a team of highly paid, inexperienced culinary graduates to cover the daily fermentation and flavor-balancing tasks I used to handle before my morning coffee, and those poor kids struggled endlessly. You cannot rush biology, and you cannot fake depth.
I spent my days quietly checking in delivery trucks, organizing dry storage racks,
and occasionally answering minor logistical questions for the new prep managers who could barely navigate the difference between a lacto-ferment and a basic brine.
Through it all, I kept my eyes open and my mouth shut, knowing that when people assume you are just a warehouse worker, they completely forget you understand exactly how the entire machine operates. The grand corporate restructuring was announced at an all-staff meeting, packed with empty culinary buzzwords designed to hide the fact that the soul of the restaurant was being hollowed out. By the end of the month, our veteran line cooks had quit, entire prep routines were replaced with cheap commercial alternatives, and my official classification was permanently locked as a basement logistics receiver. They painted over my name on the prep kitchen door and replaced it with a generic plastic sign.
I swallowed the disrespect, did my physical labor, and let them believe I was entirely defeated.
To make matters worse, the new director expected me to hand over all my proprietary methodologies to his lead assistant, a kid who thought complex flavor profiles could be downloaded from an app. I patiently walked him through the locations of the aging barrels and showed him the basic temperature controls. He marveled at how complex the natural infrastructure was, entirely unaware that he was speaking to the person who had personally captured and cultured every single strain of yeast in the building. I watched from the sidelines as the new leadership team tried to force their accelerated timelines onto living ecosystems, risking years of carefully cultivated flavor consistency.
Instead of fighting back immediately, I began a quiet extraction project. I packed up my physical, handwritten composition notebooks, the ones detailing years of specific hydration ratios, temperature curves, and inoculation procedures. More importantly, I began quietly separating my original mother cultures. The bacterial colonies, the sourdough starters, the deeply aged liquids that formed the genetic baseline of the entire menu.
I legally own them, having brought the original strains from my own home kitchen years before the restaurant was ever incorporated. I cataloged everything in heavy glass jars and secured them, preserving a clear physical timeline of who actually created the restaurant's signature identity and who was merely trying to mimic it. I knew how fragile the new corporate facade really was, and I wanted an undeniable physical record when their shortcuts finally caught up with them. It was not about malice.
It was about ensuring my life's work survived when the inevitable collapse finally arrived.
Everything reached a breaking point when the investment group announced a monumental retail partnership. A luxury international grocery conglomerate was preparing to license, bottle, and mass-produce our three most famous components: the black garlic glaze, the signature aged chili broth, and our proprietary umami finishing sauce. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from arrogant excitement to a frenzy of high-stakes pressure. The new culinary director had assured the investors that the scale-up would be effortless.
But when you move from making 10 gallons of a complex living sauce to 10,000 gallons, chemistry does not forgive ignorance.
The buyer's rigorous food science division required massive test batches to ensure shelf stability, acidity, safety, and exact flavor replication. The new director confidently sent over his fast-tracked, artificially stabilized versions. Within 2 weeks, the grocery conglomerate halted the entire project. Their quality assurance laboratories reported that the test bottles were swelling, the flavors were dead, and the pH levels were dangerously unstable.
They demanded a complete audit of the original microbial logs, the historical baseline data, and an immediate meeting with the primary flavor architect to understand where the scaling process was failing.
Suddenly, the slick culinary director who had banished me to the basement was pacing outside the walk-in coolers, shouting at his panicked assistants, trying to explain away what he claimed was just a minor batch variation. One of his assistants came down to the loading dock later that afternoon, holding a stack of the grocery chain's laboratory rejections, quietly asking if I remembered how the original batches were stabilized. I gave him a calm look and explained that true stabilization came from months of patient microbial balancing, not chemical thickeners. Word quickly spread through the building that the massive retail conglomerate had put the entire multi-million-dollar licensing deal on hold until the core biological architecture was verified and corrected by the original creator.
I sat on a stack of flower pallets in the basement and watched the security cameras as the executive team panicked in the upstairs dining room, knowing that their expensive branding and polished marketing could not rewrite the laws of food science. The formal confrontation happened inside the main private dining room, where the lead food scientist from the grocery conglomerate sat across from our exhausted founders and the sweating culinary director. The scientist laid out a massive binder of our old internal prep logs, pointing out that every successful historical batch of the signature products was monitored, adjusted, and signed off by a single individual who seemed to have vanished from the employee roster 6 months ago.
The culinary director tried to claim that I was just a former prep cook who recorded data, and that the recipes belonged to the brand. But the scientist cut him off, stating that recipes cannot be copyrighted, and more importantly, recipes do not matter when the core ingredient is a living, proprietary biological culture that the restaurant clearly no longer possessed. When our internal ownership team realized that they had never executed a formal transfer of intellectual property for the living mother cultures during those messy startup years, the entire room fell dead silent. The founders realized that without my physical cultures and my specific procedural knowledge, the product was dead, and the massive retail deal was entirely void.
The grocery conglomerate made it incredibly clear that they would not move forward with the manufacturing contract until the biological discrepancies were resolved directly with the person who authored the original logs. The culinary director who had pushed me into a cold storage room was completely powerless, stripped of his authority by the very science he had dismissed as unnecessary clutter. Over the next 48 hours, he was quietly placed on administrative leave, his high-profile expansion initiatives immediately suspended.
The original founder personally came down to the sub-basement, standing awkwardly between stacks of cardboard boxes. He offered me the title of Executive Director of Culinary Research, complete with a massive salary correction and a retroactive profit-sharing agreement. I politely declined. I explained that I had already accepted a different offer.
True authority does not come from loud titles, pristine chef's coats, or polished boardroom presentations. It comes from being the irreplaceable foundation that holds everything together when the pressure builds. I walked out of the restaurant that afternoon carrying my notebooks and a heavy cooler containing my original mother cultures. The grocery conglomerate had no interest in partnering with a restaurant that couldn't even control its own product.
Instead, they had reached out to me directly the night before. I accepted a position as their lead developmental flavor chemist, moving my workspace out of a dark, damp basement and into a state-of-the-art national research laboratory, leaving the restaurant with nothing but a beautifully decorated dining room and a menu they no longer knew how to cook.